In the silence of the night, he stared at the yellowed pages of a notebook filled with half-formed equations, torn sketches of machines, and questions he wasn't sure he would ever answer. His fingers trembled slightly, not from fear alone, but from the weight of uncertainty pressing against his chest. Was this the seed of something extraordinary, or the scribbles of a man destined to fade into anonymity? He couldn't tell. The room smelled faintly of dust and solder, a scent that clung to him from the small workshop where he spent more hours than he did sleeping. Outside, the world seemed vast, indifferent, and unbearably silent. Larry Page was not yet the man the world would one day know. He was just a boy who had grown up in a house crowded with books, wires, and machines that hummed faintly through the night. His father had filled their home with computers when most people didn't even know how to turn one on. His mother lectured about programming at a university, her voice filled with conviction that the future belonged to those who spoke the language of machines. But to Larry, as a child, the house often felt more like a laboratory than a home. There were nights when he lay awake, staring at the ceiling, hearing the mechanical hum of old computers echoing through the floorboards. He wondered if his life had already been decided for him, if he was bound to live in the shadow of his parents' obsessions. He carried that silence inside him, a silence both comforting and suffocating, as if the machines were whispering promises he didn't yet understand. At school, he was different. Not the kind of different that wins admiration, but the kind that isolates. His voice was soft, his demeanor awkward. He spoke with a stammer when asked to explain his ideas, and his classmates often mistook brilliance for strangeness. They laughed when he described his dream of downloading the entire world's knowledge onto a single machine. To them, it sounded absurd, even comical. To him, it was the only thing that felt real. The weight of ridicule sat heavy on his chest. Every mocking smile, every careless word burned itself into memory. He learned to lower his eyes, to retreat into the quiet sanctuary of his notebooks, his machines, his imagination. That isolation became both his curse and his armor. The first step toward his destiny wasn't a bold leap into success, but a quiet decision made in the loneliness of his dorm room at Stanford. He had been reading about the structure of the internet, the fragile network of links that connected pages like threads in a spider's web. It fascinated him how one page pointed to another, how relevance might not lie in the words themselves, but in the way the world connected them. He scribbled late into the night, his mind racing faster than his pen could move. But genius, in its early form, looks a lot like madness. When he first shared his idea, the room went cold. A professor told him it was too ambitious, that organizing the entire web was not a problem a graduate student should be wasting his time on. Others dismissed it as impractical, a vanity project with no real application. Larry nodded politely, but inside he felt a storm. Was he deluding himself? Was he chasing something that didn't exist? The fear of failure wrapped itself around him like a shadow. He imagined spending years on a project that would amount to nothing more than wasted time, wasted energy, wasted youth. And yet the idea refused to let him go. It followed him into lectures, into meals, into restless nights. It clung to him with the persistence of an uninvited ghost. There was one moment that would mark him forever. A late evening in the computer lab, the building nearly empty, fluorescent lights buzzing faintly above. He had been staring at lines of code that refused to cooperate, his eyes aching from exhaustion. For a brief second, he felt the temptation to stop, to close the machine, and surrender to the ordinary path of life, finish his degree, take a job, live quietly. He thought of the safety of mediocrity, the warmth of a life where failure could no longer claw at his throat. But in that same moment, he felt something else, the unbearable weight of regret. The thought of looking back, years later, and realizing he had turned away from the one idea that might have defined him. That fear was stronger than exhaustion, stronger than doubt. So he kept going. The first obstacle came not from the machines, but from people. Convincing others to believe in something that didn't yet exist was like shouting into the wind. Investors turned him away, professors raised their brows, and friends suggested he work on something more reasonable. The internet was still young, and no one could imagine its true scale. To them, Larry's obsession was a riddle with no answer. The rejection cut deep. He carried their words with him, replaying them like a broken record in the back of his mind. Some nights, he sat alone in his room, staring at his hands as if they belonged to someone else. He felt small, insignificant, a boy drowning in a world too vast to change. And yet, there were glimpses of light. In the quiet corners of the Stanford campus, he met Sergey Brin, another restless soul with an unruly mind. Their conversations spilled late into the night, filled with arguments, laughter, and sparks of recognition. Sergey didn't dismiss his idea. He challenged it, refined it, breathed life into it. For the first time, Larry wasn't entirely alone. That companionship became a fragile rope, pulling him back from the abyss of self-doubt. Still, their project was fragile, almost invisible. A prototype that crashed more often than it worked, servers cobbled together from borrowed machines, ideas scribbled on napkins and scraps of paper. They lived in a state of near constant uncertainty, balancing between exhilaration and despair. There were moments when Larry wondered if the dream was worth the weight it carried, if the cost of trying was simply too high. The first victory didn't come with applause or recognition. It came in the form of a single test search. A query typed into the machine, processed by fragile algorithms stitched together in the quiet hours of the night. And the result, clean, precise, more relevant than anything else available, flashed onto the screen. Larry stared at it, hardly breathing. It was small, almost trivial. A single answer to a single question. But in that moment, it felt like the world had shifted. The victory was fragile, uncertain, and invisible to almost everyone else. No headlines, no investors, no applause. Just two young men in a quiet room, staring at a screen as if it had whispered a secret meant only for them. But inside Larry, something broke open. The silence that had haunted him for so long now carried a new note, possibility. He thought of every night spent doubting, every rejection, every whispered word of ridicule. And for the first time, he felt that maybe, just maybe, they had all been wrong. Yet even in triumph, he felt the weight of darkness. Because victories at the beginning are fragile things, easily crushed, easily forgotten. He knew the road ahead would be lined with more failures, more disbelief, more shadows. But he also knew something else. He could no longer turn back. The first step had been taken. The nights grew longer. The servers whirred in the corners of borrowed rooms, machines patched together with scraps, wires running like veins across the floor. Larry lived with the hum of electricity in his ears, a reminder that their fragile dream was alive, but only barely. Every crash, every failure in the code felt like a blade across his skin. He had taken the first step, but now came the cruel test. Could he keep walking when every force around him seemed determined to push him down? He remembered the professors who told him the idea was too broad, the classmates who laughed at his awkward passion, the investors who closed the door before he had even finished speaking. Their voices didn't vanish in the face of progress. They grew louder, like ghosts mocking his persistence. Doubt was not an enemy you defeated once. It was a shadow that followed him into every room, every line of code, every sleepless night. Sergey tried to joke about it sometimes. "We're building the world's most expensive science fair project," he'd say, his laughter sharp and restless. But beneath the humor, Larry saw the same fear he carried himself. The fear that the world would never see the value in what they were building, that their brilliance would dissolve into silence. Money was always scarce. Their servers overheated, Their bandwidth costs ballooned. Their lives narrowed into a tunnel where every dollar mattered. Larry skipped meals, wore the same clothes, until the fabric thinned, ignored the quiet ache in his body. Hunger and exhaustion became companions, not enemies. He learned to live with them as if they were part of the price he had to pay. There was one evening, late in the fall, when everything seemed on the verge of collapse. Their prototype had stopped working, the servers fried by overuse. Sergey slammed his hands against the desk, his face pale with frustration. Larry sat silently in the corner, his hands covering his eyes. The room smelled of burnt circuits and despair. For the first time, the thought of quitting crept into the room like smoke. He imagined what it would feel like to walk away, to silence the machines, and return to a life of safety and invisibility. He imagined the relief. But then he thought of the silence that had haunted him since childhood, the silence of machines whispering in the night, the silence of being misunderstood, the silence of an idea that refused to die. That silence would not let him go. Quitting would not erase it. It would only make it louder, so they borrowed more parts. They rewired, they rebuilt. Slowly, the machine came back to life, humming faintly as if breathing again. It was not glorious. It was survival. Their first real validation came not from money or investors, but from users. Students on campus began to use their search engine quietly, in the shadows of the internet. One query became 10. 10 became 100. People whispered about it, shared it with friends, typed their curiosity into its fragile machine. Larry watched the numbers tick upward on the server logs, his heart pounding as if each new user was a vote against the silence. It was intoxicating, but terrifying, because every new user was also a new burden. The servers groaned, the system strained, the project teetered between growth and collapse. Success didn't feel like triumph. It felt like standing on the edge of a cliff, the ground crumbling beneath your feet. There were moments of bitter irony. Investors who once dismissed him now leaned in with cautious interest, their eyes not on the vision, but on the potential profit. Larry hated those conversations, the way they spoke of numbers while ignoring the soul of the idea. But he endured them, because without money, the dream would starve. He learned to bend without breaking, to swallow pride while protecting the core of what he believed. Still, recognition did not erase the loneliness. He walked across campus and saw the same people who once mocked him now whispering his name. They looked at him differently, but the weight of those old scars never lifted. He still carried the boy who had been laughed at, who had been dismissed. Success could not erase that shadow. It only gave him more reason to outrun it. The first time he saw their company's name written down Google, it didn't feel like a crown. It felt like a question. Would this name stand the test of time, or would it be another forgotten attempt, buried in the digital graveyard? He stared at the word, simple and strange, and felt both pride and dread. Names were fragile things. They could mean everything or nothing. The journey into legitimacy was paved with sacrifices. Sleep became rare, meals irregular, relationships distant. Friends grew tired of his absence. Family wondered if he was losing himself to obsession. But how could he explain that obsession was the only thing keeping him alive? To walk away from it would be to betray not only his dream, but himself. There was one victory that stood above the rest. A small grant, a modest investment compared to the vast sums of Silicon Valley. But to Larry, it was oxygen. The day he held the check in his hands, he felt something he hadn't in years: relief. It wasn't wealth, not even close, but it was proof. Proof that the world was beginning, slowly, reluctantly, to see what he saw. Yet victory was never pure. Alongside relief came the weight of responsibility. More money meant more expectations, more eyes watching, more shadows ready to pounce at the first sign of failure. Every success made the silence louder, reminding him that the fall, if it came, would be harder now. In the quiet hours, when the world slept and only the machines hummed, Larry thought about the path behind him. He thought about the nights in his childhood home, lying awake as the computers whispered. He thought about the laughter of classmates, the rejection of professors, the slammed doors of investors. He thought about the first query that worked, the first user who returned, the first fragile spark of recognition. He realized then that the beginning had not been a moment, but a series of wounds and whispers, stitched together by persistence. The first step was not glamorous. It was painful, humiliating, almost invisible. But it was the only step that mattered, because without it, there would be nothing else. As Google grew, as the world began to chant its name, Larry carried that knowledge like a scar. People saw the empire, the billions, the fame. They did not see the nights of hunger, the machines built from scraps, the quiet despair of failure after failure. They did not see the silence that had nearly broken him. He carried it still. Even in success, he knew the truth. Beginnings are always dark, always lonely, always laced with doubt. The first step is never glorious. It is stumbling in the shadows, reaching for a light you're not sure exists. And once you take it, you are never the same again. The boy who once feared silence had built a machine that gave the world a voice. Yet inside him, the questions never faded. What if he had given up that night in the lab? What if Sergey hadn't appeared? What if the servers had never come back to life? Success did not erase those doubts. It only made them echo louder. And so he moved forward, not as a man certain of his destiny, but as someone who had learned to live with the darkness of beginnings. He knew the price of the first step, and he carried it like a reminder carved into his bones. Because the truth is this: the first step is always the hardest, the most painful, the most dangerous. It is the step no one celebrates, the step most forget. But it is the step that defines everything that comes after. And Larry Page, in all his brilliance and all his doubt, had taken it.